The things that I love about small churches that are so unique is that everyone has leadership potential and everyone is needed.
Hi, I'm Karl Vaters, and welcome to the Church Lobby Conversations on Faith and Ministry. My guest in this episode is Laurie Acker, and we'll be talking about practical ideas that work in small churches. Laurie runs smallchurchministry.com. It's an online ministry that provides resources and support for volunteers and ministry leaders in small churches. In this conversation, we'll talk about the changing face of small church ministry, especially as it relates to recruiting, training, and relying on the volunteers who are so essential in helping small churches survive and thrive in a changing world. And don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with an important reflection on the differences between the way big churches use and recruit volunteers and the way small churches rely on volunteers for everything. Well, Laurie Acker, welcome to the Church Lobby.
Woohoo! Excited to be here.
It is good to have you here. You and I have been operating in very similar, if there was a Venn diagram of your place of ministry and my place of ministry, there'd probably be about a 50% overlap, maybe.
Yeah, we'd overlap quite a bit.
Yeah, because we definitely do small church ministry. We have the same attitude and heart towards it, the same desire to see small churches thrive and to be able to create and find and distribute resources that are small church specific. But your space is really more for small church lay people, volunteers, helpers, and mine is more for small church pastors.
Yes.
So since we're talking mostly to pastors today, I think you can add an awful lot of benefit and help in the practical things that you do. But before we get into any of the specifics, give us all an idea. What's your background and how has it led you to do ministry in the small church space?
Well, I grew up in church. I'm a denominational mutt, so I've been in just about every denomination under the sun, even growing up. But right out of college, I started in ministry at a church of 3,000. And so I was actually a junior high youth director at a church of 3,000 people in the Twin Cities. And that was quite an experience. And after that, I had a long stint at a church that was like about 500 people. Then I got married along the way, and my husband became a pastor, and we were serving in smaller churches. And one of the things that I noticed in smaller churches was that, I grew up in smaller churches, but my ministry experience was in this big church, and you hire people who know what they're doing, who have a lot of training. And then we're in a small church and people with big, big hearts, but not a lot of training and a lot of skills. And also the other thing I noticed was small church ministry was so different. The things that worked in larger churches did not work in smaller churches. And so that's when I really started falling in love with small church ministry, was really embracing all those differences and uniquenesses. Then along the way, I was naturally kind of training people a lot of different ministry skills, and it just kind of exploded after that. So
Okay, so how did this ministry begin? You just went online and opened up a website, or what were your first steps?
well, small church ministry kind of began out of my own boredom. Like I was like, just really had all this creativity, and my kids are getting older, and I was like, what do I do? And I started a little blog. And my blog was really about creative ministry, creative worship, arts. And that's what I did. And then in the middle of COVID, I lost my day job. And I was like, oh, I need to, recoup an income here at a time when no one is hiring. And so I held an online workshop called How to Create a Small Church Ministry You Love. And it was a hit, and it just kind of it exploded from there and started connecting with all sorts of people in small churches all around the world, really, who were looking for more skills and just a little boost of not just encouragement, but the strategies that are actually working in small churches where they were coming in frustrated. And so that's how it started. I wouldn't say it was by accident. I don't know, more of a divine appointment, as it just kind of started roller coasting along the way.
Yeah. That's one of the places where our Venn diagrams diverge but correspond, is that I tend to be coming at it from more of a, for lack of a better term, kind of a philosophical standpoint and pastoral standpoint. Let's rethink these big ideas and so on. And what I love about you is you really put boots on the ground. You have some very, very practical ideas. Just as for those who aren't aware of your ministry, here are just a couple titles of some very recent articles on your website, 7 effective tips to encourage engagement on social media. Canva, a practical guide through what it is and how to use it. 3 best tithing apps and how to use them. 3 creative school outreaches to help your community. So it's very practical, very hands-on practical stuff. It's not just you writing it. You've got a lot of folks in the stable there with you who are a part of the writing team. How is your team put together? Who's coming up with these? Because what I just read is 4 very practical skill sets that those 4 aren't going to come from one person typically. So they're coming from different places. So where are these ideas coming from? Who's in your team that's writing this stuff?
We have a community. We have over 10,000 people in a free Facebook community. And we have really connected with people all over the world. We have free conferences where we have multiple people speaking from a lot of different places. And this is where all the topics and ideas and things come from. So we'll see people sharing ideas or asking for ideas and other people posting stuff. And we're like, hey, do you want to write a blog post? And so we do have a few writers that really work with us regularly, but a lot of the ones that you're even just mentioning are really just from people in small churches who are sharing what they've done, what they've found, and what works. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about our community is really it's small church people speaking to small churches. It's not just people writing about it or figuring it out. It's people who are actually sharing what works where they're at.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really love about this. It's very practical. And when you want to spend even a little bit of time on your website, and I've spent more than a little bit of time because there's so much there, is that it's very practical, it's down to earth, and you get a sense really quickly that these aren't people who are talking just theory. These are people who are in the trenches, who are doing these things, have learned a few lessons, and then in very practical ways are passing them along. So for all those listeners who are pastors especially, I really encourage you to check out Laurie's stuff because it will help you to equip your volunteers. So go to small church ministry, smallchurchministry.com, check that out, and then there will be very practical tools that you can use within your congregation and get your lay leaders in the church connected to this. That's probably the best way, is for them to actually be a part of this conversation. With that in mind, as you're doing this and as you're having regular conversation with people who are in leadership in church, but not necessarily clergy, what are some of the biggest needs that you're seeing in small church ministry right now?
A lot of it is hope and encouragement. Just knowing that you're making a difference right where you are. As much as I am about the practicality, because it is how we built our ministry, the most life change that we've seen is people saying, oh my gosh, we really are making a difference, or oh my gosh, we really can make a difference, because they're seeing a small church, in Virginia doing this really cool thing, or a small church over in Oklahoma reaching out to foster families and things like that. And so I think a lot of it really is that hope, like hope comes before help. And there's so much discouragement in small churches, like if we were only bigger, or if we only had more kids, or if we only had more money, or if we only had a building even. When we get rid of that if only, and we look at what we do have, a lot of things start changing. So that's one of the biggest transformations, is really people finding hope and seeing, oh my gosh, like this is possible with what we have. It's not if we had more we could do. It's what can we do with what we have. It's quite fascinating and amazing and really beautiful. Small churches doing huge things that they shouldn't even be able to do. Like you look at it, it's almost like the Old Testament stories of Gideon. Like, how did they do that? With a church of 12 or a church of 20 or a church of 50.
Yeah. You, however, mentioned that you have had some early on in ministry, some very big church experience as well. So given that you've had your foot in both of those places, what are some of the key differences between big church ministry and small church ministry? Not to pit one against the other, they're both of value, but I think sometimes comparing the two is helpful because so much of what we receive for pastoral training comes from the big church context, but it's not framed that this is a big church context. It's framed as everybody should be able to do this. So being able to delineate, oh, no, that's actually a big church idea. It's a great idea coming from them. They're not wrong about it, but the small church is different. Are there some key differences that you've noticed that you would point out that might be helpful to small church pastors who aren't aware of some of those distinctions?
Oh yeah, there's tons of them. A couple of my favorites, like when you talk about differences, I start thinking about what I love about small churches, because like you say, and I believe this too, I love big churches. I love big churches. I like mid-sized churches. I love small churches, but there's some really unique differences in small churches. And so instead of looking at that challenge area, the things that I love about small churches that are so unique is that everyone has leadership potential and everyone is needed.
Mm.
So in the big church setting, if you're looking for musicians, you do auditions and the most talented people get picked. In the small church setting, hey, could you learn to play a bass guitar? Awesome. We'll have you up on Sunday and you can just be real simple with it. You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah,
just kind
yeah.
of like, what does that look like? There is so much potential for leadership development in small churches, but not if you're trying to recruit people. And that's some of the differences. Like you can't put that big church strategy and look for this, give people spiritual gifts inventories. I mean, you can do that, but that's not how you're going to find all your leaders. The difference in small churches is you look at who you have and there's that edge of potential, right? Like Jesus walking around the planet didn't find the best public speakers and managers. He found stinky fishermen, right? He took
Yeah,
stinky
yeah.
fishermen and
Uh-huh.
he developed them.
Yeah,
And I think sometimes that's one of the big church strategies that we look at a little differently in small churches is everyone's a leader.
yeah.
Everybody's been called to be a light, and it's that development process. So that's one of the differences. Another difference is intergenerational ministry. Like having that life on life and different people just in the mix all the time instead of so much segmentation. We work a lot in children's ministry and you get a curriculum and it says break your kids into small groups and age segments. And you're like, wait
Yeah.
a minute, we are a small group and we've
Uh-huh.
got a 12-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old in the same group.
Yep.
And so there's a lot of those uniquenesses for sure.
Yeah. What you're talking about reminded me of, I've just read an advanced copy of a book called The Gift of Small by Glenn Stanton. I think it's due to be out in October. So I'm actually going to write a foreword for it because I really enjoy what he's saying. But one of the things that he talked about in it, and he uses particular phrases that I'm not going to remember because it's off the top of my head now. But he talks about how there's two types of workers in a typical church. There's the vocational worker who does this on a consistent basis. They are there, they're in charge of something, you can rely on them every week. And then there's the occasional person where you have a big event and this person says, yeah, I'll show up and I'll help with this thing, but they're not going to be there all the time. And what he points out, I think really, really well, is in the big church, those regular workers are typically hired, or
Mm-hmm.
at least a very
Yes.
large percentage of them are hired. So you hire someone who's going to lead in worship. You hire someone who's going to be in charge of the janitorial staffs. You hire someone who's going to be in charge of the parking lot and greeters. So the volunteering in a big church is almost exclusively those one-off things. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a different dynamic too. I've got all the paid staff here that does the regular work, and I've got the volunteers who will show up on occasion and then not show up for a few months because they're busy with other things. But in a small church,
Mm-hmm.
and the smaller the church is, the more this is true, you're going to have everybody, both the regular weekly people who are doing it vocationally. I'm the worship leader at this church, but I'm not paid a penny for it. And the person who
Yeah.
shows up for the special event just to help out and doesn't show up. So the training, what you're talking about here, the picking up someone who does something else for a living and having them do something and in charge of it for the entire church. There's a
Yes.
training
Mm-hmm.
to that. So since this is what you do, you are really
Yeah.
good at this idea of helping to train the regular churchgoer to become a more vital contributor to their church and be able to bring their skills in. What are some pieces of advice that you would give to the typical small church pastor who isn't just looking for volunteers who will show up for the occasional event and help out when we need extra hands, but I've got to put somebody in charge of a department who doesn't do that for a living? That is not their vocation. Are there any pieces of
Mm-hmm.
advice you'd give to pastors who are maybe even not doing that? They're doing it all themselves because they can't imagine turning over an entire
Mm-hmm.
department to a lay leader. That's a long, involved question, and I'm
Yeah.
not even
Well,
sure there's a question in
yeah.
there, but I'll throw it out to you anyway.
No, I'm totally with you. And yeah, there are like 4 different
Yeah,
layers kind of
I do
going
that a
on
lot.
there. And one thing, yeah, no, I do the same thing. So I'm totally with you. But one thing I would say is people want to help and people want to make a significant difference. Like that is a huge
Yeah.
thing because in ministry, we get to a place where it's like, oh, those people aren't as committed as I am. And those people, they don't show up and they don't understand what I'm going through. And the truth is people want to be significant. Oftentimes we're setting up our volunteer systems in a way that we're just giving them menial things, or we don't give them the responsibility that they even want oftentimes. And the other part of that, or another piece of that, is we've got to be setting people up to succeed.
Mhm.
I have had so many terrible volunteer experiences, whether it's in the school system or in churches and things like that, where I'm like ready to work and I'm a good worker. Like people want me to work, but then I show up and it's either dysfunctional or they don't have a job for me. And then I feel like a failure and I'm thinking, wait a minute, I was ready to work. And I think we do that to people in our churches. Like there are people who are ready and willing and able, and we're missing them or we're giving them things that aren't, I don't know, are kind of below them because we're not trusting them. And I think one of the big things is building those relationships and trusting people. And when you talk about like, I'm doing it all myself, so that's the first problem, right?
There you go. Yeah,
And I just heard a pastor say that the other day, but I have to do it myself because there is no one else. And to that, I would say, no, you don't. And when you are doing it yourself, the culture is already set up for failure, right? Because you're already frazzled and you're already stressed out because you're doing it all yourself. So who are you bringing people into? You're bringing them into a culture that's already set up to fail because
yeah,
you are so used to trying to do it all. And I think oftentimes we're doing things beyond our capacity. And I don't believe God calls us to do things beyond our capacity. So if we
agreed.
are overstretched and burning out, we're doing things that God doesn't call us to do. One of the things I say a lot, and it's one of those things where you start saying it and people fill in the answer for you, right? Like, what do you call a church that doesn't have a nursery? A church. What do you call a church that doesn't have a live band? A church. What do you call a church that isn't live streaming? A church. Like, we don't have to be doing all the things we're doing. And I think that's one of the big differences in small churches, where when we really get that across, churches can be more authentic and healthier when we're actually doing less sometimes. And we can build it up in a different way when we're not setting people up in a burnout phase before they're even on board to
Yeah.
volunteer.
How do we help pastors convince congregation members? And the church has been doing all of these things you talked about. And we need to say, okay, maybe we shouldn't be doing this, or maybe we shouldn't be doing that, so that we can narrow our focus on things we do well. What would you say to the pastor who's struggling with, how do I approach my congregation about stripping things back and simplifying our approach and doing less so that we can do it well?
So you're saying the congregation wants to do all that much stuff? Is that what you're saying?
I'm going to start with the assumption that pastors are assuming that of them, whether they are or
Okay.
not.
This is what I would say. Don't tell them. Send them to me and I'll tell them. I mean, when you try to approach somebody with your own idea, there's always pushback. We talk about that in our podcast and our free conferences, everything. Like, just bring an idea up from somebody else. Hey, I read this article. I listened to this
I see.
podcast. What do you guys think about that? Because I think it's a way to, instead of saying, I want to do this, it's, hey, what do you think about this idea? Let's get on the same page. So it's not just coming down from on high or from an opposer of what we're doing, from the volunteer up, either way. Let's just get on the same page. What do you think about this idea? What would happen if? I think when we approach things in
Yeah.
that way and start the conversations, it's very different.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because then you approach it as someone who is learning it and trying to figure it out along with them and is
Mhm.
receiving help along with them, which is actually, in most situations, actually a little bit more honest, because most of the time we don't
Mhm.
have it figured out as much as we want to pretend we do. And we are trying to figure out ourselves, is it actually going to be better if we don't do this
Yeah.
particular program
Yeah.
anymore? So let's explore the idea together yeah, I love that idea. And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are two things you can do to help us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Secondly, consider becoming a financial partner on an ongoing or one-time basis. Just go to karlvaters.com/support, where you can give through Zelle, Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon using your bank account, credit, or debit card. This will help us as we continue to put these resources into the hands of the people who need them the most. There's so many things in what you just said that I want to come back to. I'm going to try to remember at least one or two of them. One of them was, so what do you say to the pastor who's been doing everything, which is a fairly typical dysfunction for a lot of small churches and small church pastors? The pastor's been doing everything, and now they've just heard you say, okay, you got to stop doing everything for them. You were very abrupt and you just like, well, that's one of the biggest problems, is just doing it all. And I agree with you. It is one of the big
Mhm.
problems.
Mhm.
But the pastor goes, okay, I'd love to train somebody else to do this, but training them to do it is going to cost me even more time
Mhm.
than what I'm already putting in. What do
Mhm.
you say to that pastor who's got that concern?
I guess I would point to it's not about the time. It's just not about the time. It's about where we're at. And it's not even about doing too much. Some of it comes down to why are we doing this much?
Hmm.
Like your own emotional health, what's driving you. We get into this just very, I don't know, productivity bent that the church is about getting all this done. And I think when we get really personal with Jesus and we got to look at why are we doing this anyway? Why are we feeling like this? Shannon Carroll, oh, I hope I'm saying her name right, has spoken at our conferences before. She and her husband wrote the book, One Thing Remains. I don't know if you've heard their story, but he actually ended up with amnesia for 30 days. He is
Really?
a pastor and he lost his memory. They never knew if he was going to get it back. And what happened is he lost his memory of the last 15 years, I believe it was, of his life. And it was all about the church. And as she was trying to tell him what their life was like, he was like, "What? I was preaching and leading music. Why did I do that?" And then she would say, "Well, this is what our life is like." He said, "Why are we doing all that? It's too much."
Yeah.
And she would just be reminding him of what their life was like. And in his memory loss, he's looking almost like a step back from himself, saying, "Why was I doing that?"
That's
You know,
fascinating.
and so I think it's not just like, how do I get other people to do all these things? It's why am I doing all these things? And why are we doing all these things? And what could we be doing? Like, how could we do this different? You know, more of like how we should be instead of just what we're doing. Was that too like ethereal or philosophical for your
No, I
question?
love that. And we'll put a link to, what's the name of the book again?
It's called One Thing Remains.
One Thing Remains. We'll put a link to that in the show
Mhm.
notes and I'll pick it up for myself. That just that concept of coming into it with a literal amnesia for him. I think some of
Mhm.
us could use some emotional and spiritual amnesia in this. What if we were to approach it with a blank slate? How would we actually perceive what it is we've been doing if we were to be
Mhm.
able to come at it with a blank slate? What a
Mhm.
fascinating way to be able to look at that. It's fairly similar to one of the pieces of advice I'm regularly giving to pastors, which is ask yourself regularly, if we weren't already doing this program, is this a
Mhm.
program we would choose to start right now? And if the
Mhm.
answer is no, we wouldn't start this, then maybe you should stop it. But those
Yeah,
kinds
for
of questions
sure.
are hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things you have particular emphasis on is on ministry to kids and youth. So, in the bonus content, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking with you about some practical ideas for kids and youth, because this is one of the biggest areas that I hear from pastors on a regular basis is our churches are aging, our small churches especially
Yeah.
are definitely aging, and how do we reach out to and engage youth and kids. So we'll do this in the bonus content. So if you are interested in this bonus content, you can get it for free by going to karlvaters.com/subscribe and getting the free newsletter. Or if you want to become a regular partner, you can go to karlvaters.com/support. All of our partners, supporters, and all of our newsletter subscribers get a link to all of the bonus material, including this. But while we'll go into it in a little bit of depth in the bonus material, let's, before we get to the lightning round, talk through a little bit of what are the kinds of ideas and ministry things that you offer to help churches, small churches, especially in kids and youth ministry.
Do you mean at my with the organization that I have?
Yeah, yeah. What is it that you offer? I know you've got summits and you've got other
Mhm.
material. What are the resources pastors can find that can help them understand how to do a youth and kids better in a small church?
Yeah, well, one thing I would say is pastors don't have to understand or get it all. You know, one of the reasons we're doing what we're doing is because pastors oftentimes feel like they need to understand it and teach it, and they're already spending 40, 50 hours a week, and small churches half the time you're bivocational. So feel free just to send people our way. We just had one of our quarterly conferences that was a small church kidmin and youth ministry conference, and so many people there. I'm like, how'd you hear about us? How'd you hear about us? Why are you here? And they'd say, my pastor told me I had to come. My pastor told me
Mhm.
I had to come. And so I think some of that is finding somebody who can train I don't want to say train your people for you because that's not really what it's about, but other people to partner with so you don't feel the weight of I need to do this or I have to figure this out, right? And so one of the things we have is we have quarterly conferences. Now, once a year is on children's ministry and youth ministry. The January conference is women's ministry. We have a real special conference in July for if you're married to the pastor. That's super, super cool. And then at the end of the year, usually in September, we have one for volunteers and team building. And so our quarterly conferences are one thing. Our blog is really great. Quite honestly, our free Facebook group is amazing. There's a lot of idea sharing. And one of the things that we do that I think is really key is we're really connecting people. Like we're connectors. There isn't just one person sharing because every small church has a different culture. I don't
Oh,
know.
yeah.
Like, I mean, it's
Yeah.
so
Oh, very
different. You
much
go to
so.
the big churches and their
Yep.
parking lot's the same, the coffee's the same,
Yep.
everything's the same. You go to little churches, if you're in a rural area, you need to hear what's working in rural areas. If you're in a suburban area, if you're in a church that's aging, church plants are also different. And so getting connected in our community is one way that people kind of start hearing all these different pockets of information. So we also have training and a network and things like that. It's a plethora of things. I like to say we have like a smorgasbord of things. It's not a
Yeah.
5-course meal. You don't have to eat it in order. You pick and choose what you need when you
Mhm.
need it. So
Yeah, and a lot of that is because, as you've mentioned, when big church pastors talk, it's about what they have in common, and when small church ministries get together, it's about how they're different from each other.
yeah, sometimes that's true.
Yeah, there are very distinct differences, sometimes in the same town, in the same denomination between two churches,
Mhm.
because the smaller the group is, the more individually they behave, or as I like to put it in my conferences, why is my church so weird? Uh,
Yes, exactly.
so to get all of that, that would be at smallchurchministry.com, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, and again, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. So
Yeah.
we're gonna get to the lightning round now, and then we'll do the bonus content. And again, for those of you who are interested in the bonus content, we're going to talk a little bit more about some practical steps for youth and children's ministry in the small church. Go to karlvaters.com/subscribe or karlvaters.com/support, and you'll get the link for all of that. But here's the lightning round for you, Laurie.
All
Question
right.
number one: what are the biggest changes you've seen in your field of ministry in the last few years, and how have you adapted to it?
Well, I think in just the ministry in churches, just worldwide, one of the biggest changes that I've been watching kind of emerge is just the recognition and priority on emotional health and being healthy. And, between Peter Scazzero's stuff and, just more trauma-informed ministry, I think that is a huge thing. And how I'm adjusting to it, I'm just telling you right now, I am embracing it. I'm reading it. I'm learning it. I am teaching it. And it is making a real huge difference. As you talk about pastors and we talk about burnout and volunteers and things like that, when our hearts change and we're in touch with what we're doing and why, it makes a huge difference. And so I love that trend right now, this focus on being, not just our doing.
Yeah, I agree fully. Yeah. Number two, what free resource like an app or website has helped you lately that you would recommend for small church ministry?
Well, I'm going to give you one that's not free, although you can find stuff she writes that is free. I read a book this past year called Trauma in the Pews by Janine McConaughey. And I think every single pastor, ministry leader, everybody should read that book. It's not about like spiritual trauma or church hurt, but it's just about the fact that our pews, our churches are filled with people who have trauma
Mhm.
and we're ignoring it. And it has really changed a lot of my ministry. And Janine McConaughey, since you said free, she does a lot of writing that she puts out there on social media
Okay.
as well. But I'm just loving that book right now.
Oh, great. Yeah, we'll put a link to that in the show notes as always. Thirdly, what's the best piece of ministry advice you've ever received?
Kind of wrapped together. I think for me, one of the things that really changed how I did ministry was really understanding that programs don't matter if people aren't cared for. Right? So we have
Mhm.
this focus on programs and doing all these things. And if we're not seeing the person in front of us, like I think of how many times we're running around trying to grab things or we forgot the supplies and the student walks in the room and you're like, I don't have time for you. I got to go grab this. And we're missing people. And I love just a little snippet out of a verse in the Bible. It was the rich young ruler, right? Everybody has all these teachings about this. But my favorite part of that story is Jesus looked at him and loved him. And I just thought about recognizing that person who is in front of you. Like, it's
Yeah.
not about the programs, it's just about the people, and they just have to be priority.
Yeah, I love that. So, what's the funniest or weirdest thing you've ever seen in church?
Well, one of them is I was speaking at First Baptist Church out in Ramsey, Illinois. I think it was just last year, and I walked around the corner and I like jumped because there was a mannequin, like a store mannequin, and she was dressed in this, really fun, happy garb. And I'm like, why is she like? It was kind of almost creepy, but I guess the pastor had used
Mannequins are
it.
more than almost creepy.
Yeah, a little bit,
Mannequins are
right?
creepy.
But she
Yeah,
was dressed all happy and, stuff.
yeah.
But I guess the pastor had used this mannequin as a prop, and it just kind of became a little bit of a church mascot. And so she's like there welcoming you at the welcome table, or they move her around, I think, in different places. But that was one of the funniest things that I have encountered walking around a corner in a strange church.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that'll do it. Oh, you've got so many different things going on. What's the easiest, best way for people to reach you online if they want to reach out to you?
Probably Facebook. Facebook is a great place through our communities. My email also is really available, Laurie@smallchurchministry.com. It's a great way to get in touch with me too.
Okay, we'll put links to all of that, including all of her social media. You are very engaged online. There's a lot of different ways to reach out to you. I
Yeah.
encourage pastors to guide your people towards her resources. It's really designed for the leaders and volunteers in your church to be able to get this stuff. And I think it's so important because if they're only hearing from someone like me, and then the pastor's trying to get it across to their congregation, there's a layer of separation there that's hard to overcome. But if you can get folks to actually go direct to Laurie's stuff and they're learning it on their own, and then the next thing you know, they're coming to you excited about something that they've learned,
Yeah.
then it's really great because there's a cooperation there and a working together that's really, really helpful. So again, we're going to have our talk about youth and kids in the small church in the bonus material, karlvaters.com/subscribe, karlvaters.com/support will get you that. But Laurie, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for the resources that you make available to small churches everywhere.
Yeah, so great to be here.
As I reflect on this conversation, I keep coming back to how big and small churches are different in what we expect from our volunteers. In big churches, the people who run ongoing ministries are typically paid staff who have been trained before they were hired, while volunteers typically come in to support those roles with temporary or unskilled help. But in small churches, it's volunteers all the way through. This is why ministries like Laurie's at smallchurchministry.com are so important, because they help provide practical training for the volunteers who are essential in small church ministry. So don't just listen to this and go on with your day. Pause to consider the ways in which small churches need to think differently about how much we rely on our volunteers and how important it is to train them well. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaters. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Karl Vaters, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.